On the afternoon of December the 2nd, 1993, humid air hung over Medellin like a shroud. On a terracotta rooftop in the middle-class neighborhood of Los Olivos, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviedo took his final breath. 2 bullets had found their mark, one through his leg, one through his ear. The Colombian National Police stood over the body of the world's most wanted criminal, a man who had terrorized a nation, corrupted governments, and built an empire on white powder and blood. His eyes stared blankly at the sky he'd once owned, the sky his planes had crossed thousands of times carrying poison to foreign shores. But 50 miles northwest, in the misty hills of Puerto Triunfo, Antioquia, something remained. Something vast and strange and terrible. 7,000 acres of paradise built on corpses. A zoo without zookeepers. Hippos wallowing in artificial lakes. Dinosaur statues crumbling in the jungle. And a white Piper aircraft, frozen forever on an entrance gate. A monument to the first successful cocaine flight that had transformed a poor boy from Rionegro into the 7th richest man on earth. This is the story of Hacienda Nápoles, a kingdom of dreams and nightmares, where exotic animals roamed free while humans were buried in unmarked graves, where children rode go-karts while their father ordered massacres from his office, where luxury and torture existed in the same breath, under the same sun, behind the same gates. The ranch is still there. You can visit it today. Pay your admission, ride the water slides, take selfies with the hippo descendants. But the ghosts remain too, in the interrogation rooms beneath the earth, in the airstrip where kilos became billions, in the colonial mansion where Pablo Escobar sat like a king, watching his empire expand across continents, believing himself untouchable. He was wrong. But before the billions, before the bombs, before the blood that soaked Colombia's streets like rain, there was a boy with nothing but hunger in his belly and ambition in his heart. A boy who would become a monster. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviedo was born on December the 1st, 1949, in Rionegro, Colombia, a small town in the Antioquia region where coffee grew on hillsides and poverty clung to families like morning fog. His father, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, was a peasant farmer who worked land he would never own. His mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, was a schoolteacher who taught children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse with a leaking roof. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a country where being ordinary meant being invisible. The family moved to Envigado, a suburb of Medellin, when Pablo was young. 7 children shared cramped rooms in a modest house. There was never enough food, never enough space, never enough money. Pablo wore hand-me-down clothes and walked barefoot on hot streets. He watched his father's hands crack from labor. He watched his mother count coins at the kitchen table, her face tight with the arithmetic of survival. Something hardened in him during those years. Not cruelty yet, but calculation. The understanding that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who took and those who were taken from. He was intelligent. His teachers noted it. He could memorize facts effortlessly, solve problems quickly, charm adults with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But school bored him. School was a place for people who believed in systems, in working hard, and waiting patiently for rewards that might never come. Pablo didn't believe in waiting. He sold contraband cigarettes on street corners at age 12. He stole tombstones from graveyards, sandblasted off the names, and resold them to monument makers. He stole cars, not for joyrides, but for profit. By 15, He was already building a reputation in Envigado's criminal underworld, a boy who would do what others wouldn't, who had no fear of consequences, who saw every law as a suggestion and every person as a potential transaction. In the late 1960s, Pablo dropped out of university, where he'd briefly studied political science. Education was too slow. He wanted money, and he wanted it now. He started small, kidnapping minor businessmen for ransom, holding them in safe houses until families emptied their bank accounts. The operations were brutal but efficient. He never showed mercy, never negotiated. Pay or receive a body part in the mail. The choice was simple. But kidnapping had limits. Too much heat from police. Too much risk. Pablo was searching for something bigger, something that could scale infinitely. And then, in the early 1970s, he found it. Or rather, it found Colombia. Cocaine, the white powder that North Americans and Europeans couldn't get enough of. The drug that made people feel invincible for 30 minutes before they came crawling back for more. The profit margins were astronomical. A kilo that cost $1,000 to produce in Colombia could sell for $50,000 in Miami, and demand was exploding. Disco clubs, Wall Street executives, Hollywood actors, college students, everyone wanted to fly. Pablo started as a smuggler for other people, a middleman moving small quantities through creative routes. He paid peasants to swallow cocaine-filled condoms and board planes to the United States. He hollowed out shoes, suitcases, and statues. He bribed baggage handlers and customs officials. Every successful shipment taught him something new about the business: who could be bought, who could be intimidated, and who needed to disappear. By 1975, Pablo Escobar was no longer working for anyone. He was the boss. He'd assembled a team of ruthless, loyal men from Medellin's slums, men like himself who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They called themselves the Medellin Cartel, though in the beginning they were just a loose network of criminals united by greed and ambition. Pablo's innovation wasn't the cocaine itself. It was the logistics. He industrialized drug trafficking. He established relationships with coca farmers in Peru and Bolivia, ensuring a steady supply of raw material. He built processing labs deep in the Colombian jungle, where chemists transformed coca paste into pure cocaine hydrochloride. He created smuggling routes by land, sea, and air, bribing entire police departments, purchasing ships, and, most importantly, buying planes. The first plane was a Piper aircraft, small and unassuming. Pablo hired a pilot named Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, a man with nerves of steel and a flexible moral compass. They loaded the Piper with 200 kilograms of cocaine, far more than anyone thought possible for such a small aircraft. The plane lifted off from a hidden airstrip in Colombia, flew low over the Caribbean to avoid radar, and landed on a rural road in Georgia in the dead of night. The cocaine was unloaded in minutes and distributed through Pablo's growing network in the United States. The profit from that single flight was over $5 million. Pablo stood on the runway when the Piper returned, staring at the plane like it was a divine messenger. This was the future. Not suitcases and condoms. Planes. Dozens of planes. Hundreds of flights. An assembly line of poison. By 1978, Pablo Escobar was moving 500 kilograms of cocaine per week into the United States. His organization employed thousands: farmers, chemists, pilots, enforcers, lawyers, accountants. Money poured in faster than he could count it. He stored cash in warehouses where rats chewed through millions of dollars in bills, and he simply wrote it off as an acceptable loss. He buried money in fields, stuffed it into walls, and eventually stopped keeping precise records because the numbers became meaningless. What's the difference between 500 million and a billion when you can't spend it fast enough? But Pablo didn't want to live like a fugitive. He didn't want to hide in slums and safe houses, always looking over his shoulder. He wanted a kingdom, a place where he was untouchable, where his power was visible and undeniable, a paradise built with blood money, where he could live like the emperor he believed himself to be. In 1978, Pablo Escobar purchased 7,000 acres of land in Puerto Triunfo, Antioquia, a remote region of rolling hills, rivers, and jungle. The property had belonged to a wealthy rancher who'd fallen on hard times. Pablo paid cash. More cash than the rancher had ever seen in his life. Enough cash that the man didn't ask questions, just signed the deed and disappeared into retirement. Pablo named his new estate Hacienda Nápoles. The construction began immediately. Pablo didn't want a ranch. He wanted a monument. He wanted every person who entered to understand who he was and what he'd achieved. He hired architects from Medellin, engineers from Bogotá, and laborers from every nearby village. Hundreds of men worked in shifts, laying foundations, pouring concrete, erecting buildings. The work took years. The labor came from multiple sources, turning plans into stone and timber. The centerpiece was a colonial-style mansion, sprawling and white, with terracotta roof tiles and arched windows that overlooked the entire estate. Inside, marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers. The furniture was imported from Europe: hand-carved wooden chairs, Persian rugs, oil paintings of pastoral scenes that had nothing to do with Colombia. Pablo's personal office occupied the second floor, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows where he could sit behind a mahogany desk and survey his kingdom like a feudal lord. But the mansion was just the beginning. Pablo built a private airport with a runway long enough to accommodate cargo planes. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was infrastructure. Planes landed at Hacienda Nápoles weekly, sometimes daily, loaded with cocaine from processing labs. The drugs were stored temporarily in warehouses on the property before being transported to distribution points. The ranch functioned as a logistical hub for the Medellin cartel's operations, a nerve center where Pablo coordinated shipments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And on the entrance gate, suspended 15 feet in the air on steel supports, Pablo mounted the original Piper aircraft from his first successful cocaine flight. It hung there like a trophy, like a coat of arms. Every person who entered Hacienda Nápoles passed beneath that plane and understood the message: this is where legends are born. Pablo didn't stop with buildings. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to impress visitors, to make them feel like they'd stepped into another world. So he built a zoo. Not a modest collection of local animals. A full-scale exotic zoo that rivaled anything in Colombia's cities. Pablo spent millions purchasing animals from black market dealers and unethical zoos around the world. Elephants were flown in from Africa. Giraffes arrived in custom-built transport containers. Zebras, ostriches, hippos, kangaroos, flamingos. Creatures that had no business existing in the Colombian jungle suddenly found themselves roaming the grounds of Hacienda Nápoles. The hippos were Pablo's favorites. He imported 4 of them, 3 females and 1 male. They were placed in artificial lakes he'd constructed specifically for them, massive bodies of water fed by natural rivers. The hippos wallowed in the mud and seemed content in their new home. Pablo would bring visitors to the lake's edge to watch them, proud as any father showing off his children. He built a bull ring, a full-sized circular arena with tiered seating where matadors could face off against bulls in traditional Spanish style. Pablo loved the symbolism. Man versus beast. Courage tested in blood and sand. He hosted bullfights for friends and associates, events where champagne flowed and crowds cheered as animals died for entertainment. He built a go-kart track, a winding circuit of asphalt, where Pablo raced against his lieutenants and his children. He was competitive, aggressive, willing to slam opponents into barriers to secure victory. Losing was not something Pablo Escobar did gracefully. He created artificial lakes beyond the ones for the hippos, pristine bodies of water stocked with fish, surrounded by carefully landscaped gardens. Bridges arched over streams, gazebos provided shade. Walking paths wound through the property, connecting different zones of the estate. And scattered throughout Hacienda Nápoles, Pablo installed life-sized dinosaur statues. Concrete replicas of tyrannosaurs, brachiosaurus, triceratops, creatures from a lost world, towering over the landscape. They were absurd and magnificent, a billionaire's whim made manifest. Children loved them. Visitors posed for photos beside them. Pablo enjoyed the surrealism, the way they made his estate feel like a place outside time, outside reality. It wasn't just a house, it was a fortress of dreams, a sanctuary where Pablo could escape the violence he'd created, even as he continued to orchestrate it from his office. Hacienda Nápoles was contradiction made physical, beauty and brutality, innocence and evil, paradise and prison existing simultaneously on 7,000 acres. By 1980, Pablo Escobar's wealth had become almost incomprehensible. The Medellin cartel was supplying 80% of the cocaine consumed in the United States. Every day, hundreds of kilograms crossed the border through an ever-evolving network of routes. Pablo's income exceeded $400 million per week. $400 million. Per week. Forbes magazine listed him as the 7th richest man in the world, with an estimated net worth of $30 billion. He owned apartment buildings throughout Medellin, which he gave away to poor families, building a Robin Hood reputation among the people. He funded soccer fields, hospitals, and housing projects. The poor loved him. They saw him as a hero, a man who'd risen from nothing and gave back to his community. They didn't see the bodies, or they chose not to. Pablo's family lived at Hacienda Nápoles for extended periods. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, whom he'd married when she was 15 and he was 24, managed the household. His children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, grew up surrounded by unimaginable luxury. They rode horses through the property. They played with exotic animals under the supervision of caretakers. They had private tutors, swimming pools, and every toy money could buy. Juan Pablo, the eldest, would later recall the surreal nature of his childhood. Eating breakfast while giraffes walked past the window, riding go-karts with his father, swimming in lakes with hippos nearby. It seemed like paradise when you were a child. It seemed like his father was the greatest man in the world. But paradise does not last forever, because while Pablo was building his kingdom, he was also building his enemies. Every kilo of cocaine created addicts. Every dollar earned was a dollar someone else didn't have. Every bribed official was a potential traitor, and every cartel lieutenant was a future rival. The Cali cartel, based in southwestern Colombia, had been growing in power and ambition. They operated differently than Pablo, quieter, more business-focused, less ostentatious. They saw Pablo's celebrity status as dangerous, his willingness to engage in terrorism as bad for business. Tensions simmered throughout the early 1980s as both cartels fought over routes, markets, and territory. Pablo responded to competition the only way he knew how: violence. When a Cali cartel distributor tried to encroach on Medellin's territory in Miami, Pablo had him kidnapped, flown to Colombia, and brought to Hacienda Nápoles. Not to the mansion, to the other buildings, the ones visitors never saw. Beneath the paradise, Pablo had constructed interrogation rooms, soundproof chambers hidden in nondescript buildings scattered across the property. These rooms had concrete floors with drains for easy cleaning. They had chains bolted to walls. They had tools, pliers, blowtorches, knives, hammers. The Cali distributor was taken to one of these rooms. He was questioned about his organization's operations, about routes and contacts and finances. When he refused to talk, the questions became accompanied by pain. Systematic, methodical pain designed to break a person's will without killing them too quickly. Pablo didn't always attend these sessions personally. He had men for that, men who'd grown up in slums where violence was a language learned in childhood. But sometimes Pablo watched, not with pleasure, but with cold calculation. This was business. This was what happened to people who challenged his empire. The man eventually talked. They always talked. And when he'd given up everything he knew, he disappeared. His body was buried somewhere on the 7,000 acres, location known only to the men who dug the hole. He became one of many. Dozens of people were killed at Hacienda Nápoles over the years. Rival cartel members, informants, thieves who'd stolen from Pablo, journalists who'd asked too many questions, politicians who'd refused bribes. One building on the property served as a kidnapping holding facility. When Pablo's organization abducted someone for ransom or leverage, they were often brought here. Rooms with barred windows and locked doors. Basic furniture. Guards who brought food twice a day and said nothing. Some hostages stayed for days, some for months. Some never left. In 1981, Pablo kidnapped Marta Nieves Ochoa, the sister of one of his own cartel partners, not because he wanted to harm her, but because she'd been taken by a guerrilla group called M19, and Pablo wanted to send a message that no one could target cartel families without consequences. He negotiated her release, but the incident demonstrated something important. Hacienda Nápoles could serve as a fortress, a place where Pablo was untouchable, where the government had no reach. The Colombian government, by the early 1980s, was becoming increasingly aware of Pablo Escobar. Politicians who'd once been happy to accept his bribes were facing pressure from the United States, which was growing tired of cocaine flooding American cities. The DEA was expanding its presence in Colombia. Journalists were writing exposés about cartel violence. Pablo's response was to buy more protection. He donated millions to political campaigns. He ran for office himself, getting elected as an alternate representative in Colombia's Congress. The position granted him parliamentary immunity, making him legally untouchable. He posed for photographs, shaking hands with politicians, attending state functions, acting like a legitimate businessman. But the facade was cracking. In 1984, Colombia's Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, publicly denounced Pablo Escobar as a criminal and drug trafficker. He demanded Pablo's removal from Congress and called for his prosecution. It was the first time a high-ranking official had openly challenged Pablo with such force. Pablo's response was swift and brutal. On April 30, 1984, assassins on a motorcycle pulled alongside Rodrigo Lara Bonilla's car in Bogotá and opened fire with machine guns. The minister died in a hail of bullets, bleeding out on the street as his driver tried desperately to escape. The assassination changed everything. The Colombian government, under immense pressure from the United States, declared war on the Medellin cartel. Military raids hit processing labs in the jungle. Assets were seized. Arrest warrants were issued. And for the first time, Pablo Escobar realized that Hacienda Nápoles might not be the sanctuary he'd believed it to be, but he wasn't ready to abandon his paradise. Not yet. Instead, he fortified it. He increased security, hiring more guards, installing surveillance equipment, stockpiling weapons. Hacienda Nápoles became less like a resort and more like a military base. The go-karts still ran. The animals still roamed. The children still played. But underneath the surface, tension coiled like a spring thus ready to break. Between 1984 and 1991, Pablo Escobar waged a terrorist campaign against Colombia unlike anything the country had ever experienced. He believed that through violence, he could force the government to abandon extradition treaties with the United States. Extradition was Pablo's greatest fear. In Colombia, he could bribe judges and intimidate witnesses. In the United States, he would be powerless. So he killed, and killed, and killed. Car bombs exploded in Bogotá, ripping through shopping districts and office buildings. Passenger planes were brought down by explosives, killing over 100 innocent people. Police officers were assassinated by the dozens. Pablo offered bounties for dead cops, paying street kids a reward for every uniform they managed to kill. Politicians, journalists, judges, anyone who spoke against Pablo became a target. Much of this campaign was coordinated from Hacienda Nápoles. Pablo sat in his office, making phone calls, issuing orders, authorizing attacks while surrounded by luxury. The disconnect was staggering. He would discuss car bomb logistics over breakfast. He would approve assassinations while watching his children play in the pool. Violence and domesticity existed side by side without apparent contradiction in Pablo's mind. The Cali cartel, seeing an opportunity, began cooperating with Colombian authorities to bring down Pablo. They formed a vigilante group called Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. Los Pepes hunted Pablo's associates, killing his lawyers, bombing his properties, targeting anyone connected to him. It was cartel warfare mixed with government counterinsurgency, a bloody chaos that consumed Colombia. Hacienda Nápoles came under increasing pressure. The Colombian military conducted raids on the property, searching for Pablo and evidence of his operations. They found weapons caches, documents detailing cocaine shipments, and the interrogation rooms with their sinister purpose obvious. But they never found Pablo. He'd already fled, moving between safe houses in Medellin, staying one step ahead of his pursuers. The estate, once a symbol of Pablo's invincibility, became a liability. He couldn't return without risking capture. The property sat largely empty, maintained by skeleton staff, while exotic animals continued to roam the grounds, oblivious to the war raging beyond the gates. In 1991, facing relentless pressure and fearing extradition, Pablo negotiated a surrender with the Colombian government. The terms were extraordinary. He would serve a 5-year sentence in a prison of his own design, built on land he owned near Medellin. The prison was called La Catedral, the cathedral. Calling it a prison was generous. Pablo had constructed a luxury facility with a soccer field, bar, waterfall, and private quarters that resembled a high-end apartment more than a cell. He continued running his cartel from La Catedral, conducting business meetings, ordering killings, and living in comfort. It was imprisonment in name only. But even this arrangement couldn't last. In 1992, after Pablo murdered 2 of his own lieutenants inside La Catedral, the government decided to transfer him to a real prison. Pablo escaped before they could. He simply walked out, disappearing into Medellin with help from guards he'd bribed. For the next 16 months, Pablo Escobar lived as a fugitive in his own city. He moved constantly between safe houses, never staying more than a few nights in one location. His family fled to Germany, seeking asylum. His empire crumbled as authorities systematically dismantled the Medellin cartel's infrastructure. Los Pepes killed his associates one by one, and Pablo was powerless to stop them. Hacienda Nápoles was seized by the Colombian government in 1992. The property was ransacked by soldiers looking for hidden cash and evidence. Locals from nearby towns broke through fences and looted what they could: furniture, fixtures, anything of value. The mansion was stripped down to bare walls. Windows were smashed. Graffiti appeared on the colonial exterior. The animals, however, remained. No one knew what to do with them. The elephants, giraffes, and most exotic species were eventually transferred to legitimate zoos. But the hippos stayed. They were too large, too difficult to move, and surprisingly well adapted to their Colombian environment. They multiplied, spreading beyond the original lakes into nearby rivers. By the 2000s, Colombia had a wild hippo population descended from Pablo's original four, a bizarre ecological legacy of drug money. Pablo's final days were spent in paranoia and isolation. He communicated with his family through brief, traceable phone calls that he knew were being monitored but couldn't resist making. He missed his children. He missed his wife. He missed Hacienda Nápoles, the paradise he'd built and lost. On December 2, 1993, Colombian intelligence traced one of Pablo's phone calls to a house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. The Search Block, a special Colombian police unit trained and funded by the United States, surrounded the building. Pablo, along with his bodyguard Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, attempted to escape across the rooftops. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the afternoon air. Pablo ran, limping from a leg wound, trying to reach the edge of the roof where he might drop to safety. He didn't make it. A bullet entered through his ear and exited through his temple, killing him instantly. His body slumped on the terracotta tiles, blood pooling around his head. The police posed for photographs with the corpse, smiling. They'd killed the most notorious criminal in history. Colombia's nightmare was over. But 50 miles away, Hacienda Nápoles remained, empty, haunted, waiting. In the years immediately following Pablo Escobar's death, Hacienda Nápoles existed in a strange purgatory. The Colombian government had seized the property, but no one quite knew what to do with 7,000 acres of land tainted by blood and cocaine money. The mansion stood empty, its marble floors covered in debris and dust. Rain leaked through holes in the terracotta roof. Vines crept up the colonial walls, nature beginning the slow process of reclamation. The locals from Puerto Triunfo and surrounding villages viewed the estate with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some believed it was cursed, that the ghosts of Pablo's victims wandered the grounds at night. Others saw opportunity. Looters returned repeatedly, stripping anything that hadn't been taken in the initial government seizure. Door frames, copper wiring, ceramic tiles, all of it disappeared piece by piece, sold in black markets or repurposed in nearby homes. The zoo animals that remained continued their surreal existence. The hippos thrived, reproducing in their artificial lakes and gradually migrating into the Magdalena River system. Without natural predators and with abundant food sources, they multiplied far beyond what anyone had anticipated. By the late 1990s, the original 4 hippos had become 16. By 2010, the population exceeded 40. Today, estimates place the number at over 80, making Colombia home to the largest population of hippos outside of Africa. Environmental scientists began raising alarms. hippos are aggressive, territorial animals responsible for more human deaths in Africa than almost any other large mammal. They're also ecosystem disruptors, their waste-altering water chemistry and their grazing habits destroying native plant species. The Colombian hippos were becoming an invasive species, a biological problem with no easy solution. Killing them sparked outrage from animal rights activists. Relocating them was prohibitively expensive. Sterilization programs moved too slowly to keep pace with reproduction. The hippos became a living monument to Pablo Escobar's legacy, exotic, dangerous, and impossible to erase. The dinosaur statues remained too, slowly crumbling in the tropical climate. Paint peeled from concrete skin. Jungle growth wrapped around their legs and tails. They looked less like attractions and more like ruins from a civilization that had collapsed, which, in a sense, they were. Children from nearby villages would sneak onto the property to explore, daring each other to venture deeper into the abandoned estate, telling stories about what they'd seen or heard. The airstrip, though damaged by weather and disuse, was still visible, a long scar of cracked pavement cutting through vegetation. And at the entrance gate, suspended on steel supports weathered by years of rain, the white Piper aircraft remained. It had become the most iconic symbol of Hacienda Nápoles, photographed by journalists and curious visitors who came to witness the ruins of Pablo's empire. The plane that had carried the first major cocaine shipment to the United States hung there like a fossil, a relic of a time when one man had challenged governments and won, at least for a while. For nearly a decade, Hacienda Nápoles rotted. The Colombian government debated its fate in bureaucratic meetings that went nowhere. Some officials suggested demolishing everything, erasing the property completely to remove the stain from Colombia's history. Others argued for preservation as a historical site, a reminder of the cost of drug trafficking. Most simply wanted to forget it existed. Then, in 2006, something unexpected happened. A Colombian businessman saw potential in the ruins, not as a monument to Pablo Escobar, but as a transformation, a redemption story. He proposed converting Hacienda Nápoles into a family theme park. The idea seemed absurd at first. Turn a drug lord's torture compound into a place where children could play. Build water slides where cocaine had once been processed. Host birthday parties on land where bodies had been buried. But the businessman's vision was precisely that audaciousness. He argued that Colombia needed to reclaim this space, to take something dark and transform it into something benign, even joyful. The alternative was letting it remain a shrine to Pablo Escobar, a pilgrimage site for narco wannabes and morbid tourists. Better to flood it with families, cotton candy, and chlorinated water. Better to make it so mundane that the darkness would fade through sheer normality. The government, exhausted by the property's limbo status and recognizing the potential tourism revenue, agreed. Hacienda Nápoles would become Parque Temático Hacienda Nápoles, Hacienda Nápoles Theme Park. The transformation began in 2007. Contractors arrived to renovate structures and build new attractions. The mansion, too damaged to fully restore, was partially rebuilt as a museum dedicated to the history of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. Not a celebration, the creators insisted, but an educational exhibit. Rooms displayed photographs of Pablo's victims, testimonies from survivors, and documentation of the violence he'd inflicted on Colombia. The message was meant to be cautionary. This is what happens when greed and violence go unchecked. But the line between education and glorification proved difficult to maintain. Visitors posed for selfies in front of photographs of Pablo. They bought souvenirs, t-shirts, mugs, keychains, emblazoned with his image. Some left flowers at a memorial plaque. The museum's intention was condemnation, but the reality was ambiguous. Pablo Escobar, even in death, even as a cautionary tale, remained compelling. People couldn't look away. New attractions were constructed across the property. A massive water park was built featuring slides, wave pools, and lazy rivers. Safari-style tours were organized to take visitors through sections of the estate where they could observe the hippos in their lakes, along with other animals that had been introduced to replace the exotic species that had been relocated. A butterfly garden was planted. A memorial park honored victims of drug violence, and the Piper aircraft remained on the entrance gate. The park's operators debated removing it. After all, it glorified drug trafficking. But they ultimately decided to leave it, reasoning that it had become an inseparable part of the site's identity. Tourists expected to see it. It appeared in every article about Hacienda Nápoles. Removing it would be like acknowledging that the past could be erased, which it couldn't. Parque Temático. Hacienda Nápoles opened to the public in 2007. Initial visitor numbers were modest, mostly Colombians curious about the transformation. But word spread. International media covered the story. Drug lord's ranch becomes family paradise, and from cocaine to water slides, the bizarre transformation of Escobar's estate. The coverage was both fascinated and troubled, unable to reconcile the site's history with its present function. Families came, thousands of them. Parents brought children to splash in pools built over land where torture chambers had once operated. Kids rode bumper cars near where car bombs had been constructed. Birthday parties were held in pavilions that stood on property where kidnapping victims had been imprisoned. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How do you enjoy a water slide when you know what happened here? How do you eat ice cream while standing on a mass grave? The park's existence forced uncomfortable questions about memory, redemption, and whether places can be cleansed of their histories. Some visitors came specifically because of the dark history. They weren't interested in the water park or the safari tour. They wanted to walk where Pablo had walked, to see the office where he'd ordered murders, to stand in the interrogation rooms and imagine what had transpired there. This subset of dark tourism troubled Colombia's government and many of its citizens. These weren't people learning from history. They were people consuming it as entertainment, thrilling themselves with proximity to evil. The park's management struggled with this. They added more educational elements, more explicit condemnations of Pablo and the cartel violence. But they couldn't control how visitors interpreted the space. They couldn't stop someone from admiring Pablo's ambition while ignoring his atrocities. They couldn't prevent the selfies, the glorification disguised as curiosity. The survivors of Pablo's violence had strong opinions. Some were appalled by the park's existence, viewing it as a desecration of memory. How dare Colombia turn suffering into profit? How dare they build a theme park where their loved ones had died? These voices called for the property to be demolished, for every structure to be torn down and the land returned to wilderness. Others saw the transformation differently. At least now, they argued, people were talking about what happened. At least there was a museum documenting the victims' names and stories. Before the park, Hacienda Nápoles had been rotting in obscurity, visited only by vandals and narco-tourists who came to worship Pablo's legacy. Now, thousands of people were exposed to the truth of his violence, even if they came for water slides. The debate had no resolution. Both perspectives held validity. Memory is complicated. Redemption is uncertain. Meanwhile, the hippos continued to multiply. By 2015, Parque Temático Hacienda Nápoles was attracting over 400,000 visitors annually. It had become one of Colombia's most popular tourist destinations, generating millions in revenue for the local economy. Puerto Triunfo, the small town nearest to the estate, transformed from an impoverished backwater into a bustling tourist hub. Hotels were built, restaurants opened, souvenir shops lined the streets, selling Pablo Escobar merchandise alongside traditional Colombian crafts. The economic impact was undeniable. Jobs were created, infrastructure improved. The Colombian government pointed to Hacienda Nápoles as a success story, an example of how the country was moving beyond its violent past and building a future based on legitimate enterprise. But the hippos were becoming a crisis. The population had grown to over 60, and they were spreading far beyond Hacienda Nápoles into the Magdalena River system, Colombia's primary waterway. Hippos were being spotted hundreds of miles from the original estate, establishing territories in new regions. Fishermen reported aggressive encounters. Farmers complained of crop destruction. In 2009, the Colombian military attempted a cull, shooting and killing one adult male hippo named Pepe. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Animal rights activists from around the world condemned the killing. Social media campaigns demanded protection for the hippos, calling them innocent victims of Pablo's legacy who deserved preservation. Colombian officials, surprised by the intensity of the reaction, suspended the cull indefinitely. Scientists proposed alternatives. Sterilization programs were initiated, though they were expensive and logistically complex. Each hippo needed to be sedated, operated on, and monitored for recovery, a process that cost thousands of dollars per animal and required teams of veterinarians. At the rate hippos were reproducing, sterilization couldn't keep pace. Some suggested relocation to other countries, but no zoo or wildlife preserve wanted to accept dozens of aggressive, difficult-to-house hippos. The costs of transport alone would run into millions of dollars. The most radical proposal was controlled hunting, allowing licensed hunters to kill hippos for a fee, with proceeds going to conservation efforts. This idea was immediately rejected as politically impossible. Colombians had developed an odd affection for the hippos, seeing them as quirky symbols of the country's ability to transform even Pablo Escobar's legacy into something unique. Killing them felt like killing a part of Colombia's strange redemption story. So the hippos remained, and multiplied, and spread. Environmental scientists predict that without intervention, Colombia could have over 1,500 hippos by 2050, creating cascading ecological consequences that are still poorly understood. The hippos, like so much of Pablo Escobar's legacy, became a problem with no good solution, a problem that future generations would inherit, long after everyone who remembered Pablo personally had died. Inside the park, the museum dedicated to Pablo's life and crimes underwent several revisions. Initial exhibits had been criticized for being insufficiently critical, for presenting Pablo's biography without adequate emphasis on his victims. In response, curators expanded sections documenting specific atrocities. One room focused on the 1985 Palace of Justice siege, when Pablo's organization supported the M19 guerrilla group's attack on Colombia's Supreme Court. The siege resulted in the deaths of over 100 people, including 11 Supreme Court justices. The room displayed photographs of the victims, testimonies from survivors, and burned documents recovered from the building. Another room detailed the 1989 bombing of Avianca Flight 203, which Pablo ordered to kill a single presidential candidate who was supposed to be on board. The candidate changed his travel plans at the last minute. The plane exploded anyway, killing all 107 passengers and crew. The room was designed to be overwhelming. 107 portrait photographs covering every wall, forcing visitors to confront the scale of death resulting from Pablo's paranoia. A third room documented the assassinations of police officers, journalists, and judges. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with names. Over 4,000 Colombian police officers were killed during Pablo's war against the government. Each name represented a life, a family destroyed, a community traumatized. These exhibits were powerful and necessary. They refused to let visitors romanticize Pablo Escobar. They insisted on the truth. He was not a Robin Hood, not an anti-hero, not someone to admire. He was a mass murderer whose ambition required the destruction of human lives on an industrial scale. But even these exhibits couldn't fully control the narrative. Some visitors spent 15 minutes in the victim memorial rooms and an hour posing for photos at Pablo's desk. The human capacity for compartmentalization is remarkable. People can acknowledge atrocity in the abstract while still feeling fascinated by the person who committed it. The park's gift shop presented another moral dilemma. Initially, it sold standard theme park merchandise, stuffed hippos, water bottles, T-shirts with the park's logo. But visitors kept asking for Pablo Escobar souvenirs. Eventually, the park relented, selling items that walked a fine line between historical memorabilia and glorification. T-shirts with Pablo's face were marketed as historical figures, merchandise placed alongside shirts featuring Simón Bolívar and Gabriel García Márquez, as if Pablo belonged in the same category as liberators and Nobel laureates. Each purchase represented a small ethical compromise. Was it okay to profit from Pablo's image if the profits went toward maintaining a park that included victim memorials? Was it acceptable to sell a coffee mug with Pablo's face if the buyer also spent an hour learning about his crimes? The park's management justified these decisions economically. The souvenirs generated revenue that funded the park's operations, including the educational exhibits. Without the Pablo merchandise, they argued, the park might not be financially viable, and if the park closed, the property would return to decay, becoming once again a shrine for narco-tourists rather than a complex memorial site. It was a Faustian bargain, and everyone involved knew it. But pragmatism had won over purity. In 2018, a Colombian documentary crew received permission to film extensively at Hacienda Nápoles. Their goal was to create a comprehensive historical record of the property, interviewing former workers, local residents, and survivors of Pablo's violence. The resulting film, Nápoles Paradise and Prison, aired on Colombian television and later appeared on international streaming platforms. The documentary included interviews with men who'd worked at the estate during Pablo's ownership. They spoke carefully, aware that admitting too much could bring legal consequences. But fragments of truth emerged. One former groundskeeper described maintaining the gardens around the mansion while knowing that terrible things happened in the buildings he was forbidden to enter. He'd heard screams sometimes, carried on the wind at night. He'd seen men arrive in vehicles with blacked-out windows and never seen them leave. He'd been paid well enough not to ask questions, and he'd had a family to feed. Guilt and survival existed in the same breath when he spoke. A pilot who'd flown cocaine shipments from Hacienda Nápoles' airstrip talked about the logistics. Each flight carried 400 kilograms of cocaine packed in waterproof containers. He'd flown routes to Panama, Guatemala, and Mexico, landing on hidden airstrips controlled by partner organizations. He'd been paid $10,000 per successful flight, more money than he could have earned in years through legitimate work. He knew he was participating in something terrible. He did it anyway. The documentary also interviewed Maria Victoria Henao, Pablo's widow, who'd been living in Argentina under an assumed name. She'd spent decades trying to escape her husband's shadow, and she spoke about Hacienda Nápoles with a mixture of nostalgia and horror. She described the estate's beauty, the mornings when she'd walk through gardens with her children, when life had seemed almost normal. She remembered dinner parties where Pablo played the generous host, entertaining politicians and businessmen, everyone pretending that the wealth came from legitimate sources. She remembered her children's laughter as they played with exotic animals, innocents unaware of how their paradise was funded. But she also remembered the fear, the way Pablo would disappear into his office for hours, emerging with instructions for violence, the knowledge that people were being killed on the property, that bodies were buried somewhere beneath the flowers, the understanding that her husband, the man she'd married at 15, was responsible for unthinkable suffering. Maria Victoria had never been charged with crimes, though many believed she'd known more than she admitted. She'd taken her children and fled after Pablo's death, changing their names and trying to build anonymous lives. But anonymity is difficult when you're the widow of the world's most famous criminal. In the documentary, she expressed ambivalence about the theme park. Part of her was glad that the property had been transformed into something that brought joy rather than pain, but part of her felt that turning her former home into a tourist attraction trivialized what had happened there, made it consumable, entertainment for people who'd never lived the reality. She never returned to Hacienda Nápoles. She couldn't. The memories were too heavy. Juan Pablo Escobar, Pablo's son who changed his name to Sebastián Marroquín, became an architect and author. He wrote books about his father, attempting to reckon with the legacy he'd inherited. In interviews, he spoke about Hacienda Nápoles as a place of contradictory memories. He remembered swimming in pools while his father watched, proud and affectionate. He remembered birthday parties with clowns and magicians, surrounded by more gifts than any child could possibly want. He remembered riding through the property on horseback, feeling like he owned the world. Because, in a sense, his father did. But he also remembered the tension, the way conversations would stop when he entered a room, the visitors who came late at night and left before dawn, the increasing number of guards, the weapons everywhere, the gradual understanding that his father wasn't a businessman, as he'd been told, but something else entirely. Sebastián visited Hacienda Nápoles in 2010 as part of a documentary project. He walked through the ruined mansion, his childhood home now a museum. He stood in his former bedroom, a space that had been stripped bare, walls covered in graffiti. He visited the lakes where he'd watched hippos, now wild and multiplying beyond control. In an interview conducted during that visit, Sebastián said something that captured the complexity of the place. Every good memory I have of Hacienda Nápoles is built on someone else's suffering. Every happy moment was paid for with blood. That's a truth I have to live with every day. He supported the park's existence, believing that transformation was better than abandonment. But he also acknowledged that no amount of water slides could truly cleanse the property. Some stains go too deep. In recent years, the Netflix series Narcos introduced Pablo Escobar's story to a global audience, many of whom had only vague awareness of his history. The show was entertaining, well-produced, and controversial. It glamorized aspects of Pablo's life while also depicting his violence. Viewers around the world became fascinated with the cocaine cowboy who'd challenged governments and built an empire. The series' popularity had direct effects on Hacienda Nápoles. Tourism increased dramatically, particularly among international visitors who came specifically because of Narcos. The park added a Narcos-themed tour, taking visitors to locations featured in the series. Gift shops began selling Narcos merchandise alongside Pablo memorabilia. This development troubled many Colombians. The country had spent decades trying to move beyond its association with drug trafficking, attempting to rebrand itself as a destination for culture, biodiversity, and innovation. But here was the old narrative again, packaged as entertainment, drawing tourists who wanted to take selfies at a drug lord's estate. Colombian politicians debated whether the park should be closed, whether its existence was hindering the country's efforts to redefine its international image. Some argued that Hacienda Nápoles had become a narco-tourism destination that attracted exactly the wrong kind of visitors. Others pointed to the economic benefits, the jobs created, the families supported by tourism revenue. The debate mirrored larger questions about how societies should handle dark history. Do you preserve sites of atrocity as reminders, or do you demolish them to prevent glorification? Do you trust people to learn from history, or do you assume they'll misinterpret it? There are no universally accepted answers. What is certain is that Hacienda Nápoles exists in a state of permanent tension between its past and present, between remembrance and entertainment, between education and exploitation. The tension is visible in every aspect of the property. The victim memorials next to water slides, the torture chamber ruins near the butterfly garden, the hippos descended from Pablo's vanity project now threatening Colombia's ecosystem. The interrogation rooms, partially excavated and preserved, remain among the park's most disturbing features. They're not advertised prominently. You won't find them on family tour routes. But they're accessible to visitors who ask, typically shown to journalists, researchers, and those with specific interest in the property's darkest history. The rooms are small, underground chambers with concrete walls and floors. Drainage systems are still visible, designed to wash away blood. Chains remain bolted to walls. The air inside is cool and damp, untouched by the tropical sun above. Standing in these spaces, the cheerful sounds of the theme park, children laughing, water splashing, music playing, feel obscene. The proximity of joy to suffering, separated by only a few hundred yards, forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capacity for compartmentalization. People died here. Not quick deaths, but prolonged deaths involving intentional pain. They died because they'd challenged a man's business interests, or because they knew too much, or simply because killing them sent a message to others. Their bodies were disposed of like waste, buried in unmarked locations, their families left to wonder what had happened. No memorial identifies these victims by name. Many remain unknown, their identities lost to history. They're the forgotten casualties of the cocaine trade, people who existed only as obstacles to profit margins. The park includes a memorial wall with space for flowers and photographs, inviting families of victims to create personal tributes. Some do. Others refuse to set foot on the property, believing that their loved ones' deaths should not be part of a tourist attraction, that suffering should not be consumed as entertainment. Both responses are valid. Both are inadequate. Nothing can truly honor the dead or adequately account for the violence that created this place. Today, in 2025, Parque Temático Hacienda Nápoles continues to operate, hosting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The property has expanded its offerings, adding new attractions and experiences while maintaining the museum and memorial spaces. The mansion, partially restored, stands as a monument to contradictions. Some rooms have been decorated to approximate their appearance during Pablo's ownership, filled with period furniture and personal items. Other rooms remain bare, deliberately left in their deteriorated state to emphasize decay and consequences. Pablo's office, the room from which he coordinated his empire, has been preserved behind plexiglass. Visitors can peer in at the desk, the chair, the window overlooking the estate. Audio recordings play excerpts from intercepted phone calls, Pablo's voice discussing shipments and hits with his lieutenants. It's meant to be educational, contextualized by information about his victims, but the effect is still unsettling. You're listening to a mass murderer conduct business, his voice preserved long after his death. The airstrip, though no longer functional, remains visible, a scar across the landscape. The park offers historical tours that explain its role in Pablo's operations, how hundreds of flights took off from this remote location, carrying tons of cocaine to destinations across the hemisphere. The scale of the operation becomes tangible when you stand on the cracked pavement and imagine the logistics required, the coordination between pilots, smugglers, distributors, and corrupt officials. And at the entrance, the White Piper aircraft still hangs on steel supports. It's been repainted multiple times over the years, maintained against rust and decay. It remains the first thing visitors see when they arrive, and the last thing they see when they leave. An icon, a trophy, a reminder, depending on your perspective. The hippos, now numbering over 80, have become Hacienda Nápoles' most famous residents, far more famous than the park itself. They've been featured in documentaries, scientific studies, and international news coverage. Environmental organizations debate strategies for managing them, while animal rights groups insist on their protection. The situation has no clear resolution, only ongoing negotiation between competing values and practical constraints. Some scientists have proposed accepting the hippos as a permanent part of Colombia's ecosystem, a process called Anthropocene rewilding. The argument is that since large herbivores similar to hippos once existed in South America during the Pleistocene era, hippos might fill an ecological niche left vacant by extinct megafauna. It's a controversial theory, opposed by most mainstream ecologists who view hippos as invasive species threatening native biodiversity. But the hippos don't care about scientific debates. They continue living their lives in Colombian rivers, mating and multiplying, creating a legacy that will outlast memory of Pablo Escobar himself. Centuries from now, when Pablo is footnote in history books, his hippos might still be here, an indelible mark on the continent's ecology. Standing at Hacienda Nápoles today, you're surrounded by layers of time and meaning that refuse to settle into simple narrative. The past is visible, in architecture, in photographs, in memorial plaques. The present is tangible, in laughter, in commerce, in the mundane business of tourism. And the future is uncertain, in hippos multiplying toward ecological crisis. In how next generations will interpret this place's significance. If you visit the park's museum and actually engage with the victim testimonies, if you read the names and see the photographs and confront the scale of suffering, you might leave feeling appropriately disturbed. You might leave understanding that Pablo Escobar's story is not compelling because he was admirable, but because he revealed something true about human capacity for evil when combined with intelligence and opportunity. But if you spend your visit riding water slides and posing for selfies beneath the Piper aircraft, if you buy a Pablo Escobar t-shirt and leave without visiting the victim memorials, you'll have participated in something else entirely. You'll have consumed atrocity as entertainment, transformed suffering into souvenirs. The park allows both experiences. It can't prevent misinterpretation or ensure appropriate solemnity. It can only exist, contradictory and uncomfortable, waiting for each visitor to decide what meaning they'll extract from 7,000 acres of beauty and horror. The Colombian government has recently announced plans to expand the educational components of Hacienda Nápoles, partnering with universities to create research facilities focused on drug policy, violence prevention, and transitional justice. The goal is to transform the property into a center for studying how societies recover from periods of extreme violence, using Pablo's estate as both cautionary tale and case study. Whether this initiative will succeed or become another layer of complexity added to an already impossibly layered site remains to be seen. Good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. Education doesn't automatically lead to wisdom. What's certain is that Hacienda Nápoles will continue generating debate, discomfort, and fascination for years to come. It defies easy categorization. It resists simple moral judgment. It forces confrontation with questions about memory, redemption, and whether places can ever fully escape their histories. The answer to that last question is probably no. Places remember. Land holds memory in ways that transcend human intention. You can build water parks and plant gardens and bring in families with children, but you can't extract violence from soil where it's seeped deep. You can't wash blood from concrete once it's been absorbed into foundation. Hacienda Nápoles is permanently stained. The transformation is real, but incomplete. Paradise and prison coexist, occupying the same space, visible depending on where you look and what you're willing to see. Pablo Escobar is gone now. He's been dead longer than he was alive at his death. The empire he built has crumbled. The Medellin cartel is history. Most of the people he killed have been forgotten by everyone except their families. Colombia has changed dramatically, becoming safer, more prosperous, more stable than during the violence of the 1980s and early 1990s. But Hacienda Nápoles remains, 7,000 acres of land that refuse to be only one thing: a theme park, a memorial, an ecological crisis, a tourist attraction, a warning, a gravesite, a bizarre redemption project, a place of laughter and of ghosts. The White Piper aircraft hangs on the entrance gate, preserved in perpetuity. A monument to the moment when Pablo Escobar discovered that small planes could transport large quantities of cocaine, transforming himself from a small-time criminal into a billionaire who challenged governments. That discovery killed hundreds of thousands of people through addiction, violence, and the destabilization of entire societies. But it also created the wealth that built a paradise where exotic animals could roam and children could play. The connection between those things, the cocaine flights and the zoo, the torture chambers and the water park, the mass graves and the safari tours, is not metaphorical. It's direct. One paid for the other. Blood money became hippos and dinosaur statues and colonial architecture. You can visit Hacienda Nápoles today. You can buy your ticket at the entrance, pass beneath the Piper aircraft, and spend the day enjoying attractions. You can swim in pools and eat lunch at the restaurant and buy souvenirs. You can do all of this while knowing what happened here, or you can do it while ignoring what happened here. The park allows both. It judges neither. But if you listen, really listen, you might hear something beneath the cheerful sounds of tourism. Echoes, whispers, the accumulated weight of violence that no amount of transformation can fully erase. The hippos will outlive us all. They'll still be here when the theme park eventually closes, when the mansion crumbles completely, when everyone who remembers Pablo personally has died. They'll remain in Colombian rivers, bizarre ambassadors from a nightmare that became real, then became history, then became tourism, then became something too strange for language to fully capture. That's Pablo Escobar's legacy in its purest form, not the cocaine empire or the billions of dollars or the violence that terrorized a nation, but hippos multiplying in a country they never should have reached, creating problems that persist long after their creator turned to dust. If this story moved you, Share it with someone who needs to understand that wealth built on suffering never truly escapes its foundation. Leave a comment below with the word "remember," not for Pablo, but for the thousands of unnamed victims whose deaths made his paradise possible. And if you want more hidden histories of power, empire, and the architecture of ambition, make sure you're subscribed. These stories don't tell themselves, and they're too important to forget. Hacienda Nápoles waits in Puerto Triunfo, Antioquia, Colombia. It's open daily. Admission is affordable. The water is warm. The hippos are visible from designated viewing areas. The gift shop accepts credit cards. The victim memorial is in the basement. Choose your own experience. Choose your own meaning. The property doesn't care. It survived worse than your judgment. The cocaine king is dead. The paradise remains. And somewhere beneath the laughter and the water slides and the carefully maintained gardens, the darkness persists, patient and permanent, waiting for those who dare to acknowledge its presence.